I hope that in the room with you today and out in the spaces where you're doing your day-to-day work, you are with early educators, joining their expertise with yours to make our systems more effective and more equitable. Here at CSCCE, early educators for decades have continued to tell us what they need to thrive as people and in their role as teachers and caregivers. And central to this is that they need good jobs, jobs with wages and benefits that allow them to support themselves and their families. And they need to have this regardless of the setting in which they work or how their program is funded. With stabilization funding, we have seen more investments in pay and benefits and without strings attached, where people are able to access the funding without having to do more beyond their jobs. But this still hasn't solved the compensation problem. The reality is that as a field, we have spent many years and resources focused on more education, more training, and more monitoring of the workforce, and not enough on their pay and their working conditions. I observe this to be in the spirit of moving to a quality workforce, as I often hear it. But let's think about what that language and the beliefs behind it mean, that somehow we have to change the people. The people are not the problem. It's the poverty level wages and their working conditions that are the problem. So what has driven this perception that the workforce needs to change or do more in order to be paid more? It's the persistent undervaluing of work that's seen as women's work that's often done by women of color. This even sometimes comes from those working within and on behalf of ECE. And it's also the ways in which racism and sexism are embedded in our systems. And the impacts are many, but one of the most harmful realities is this, that Black and Latina early educators, as we've documented in our research, are paid thousands of dollars less than their peers. In California, for example, Black and Latina educators are paid nearly $8,000 a year less. This is a systemic problem. And while we often understand systemic racism and inequities as being embedded in current policies and practices, it's also an absence of policies to protect from inequities or to dismantle them. For example, though we documented racial wage gaps that are being driven by public funding and policy in a state, there's not an entity that's tasked with monitoring this or correcting this. But we don't have to accept this, right? Our policy choices today are determining whether we will endure yet another generation of a childcare crisis, or if this time is looked back on as the point when repair took hold. Certainly, if ECE were treated and funded as a public good, programs could afford more readily to make ECE a good job. But that alone doesn't address the inequities or the instincts to fix or change the workforce. And there are things that we can do now and you can do now to take action. Invest in data and analysis to pinpoint disparities, to identify who's benefiting from and who's harmed by specific policies and programs. Doing things like establishing a salary scale that's driven by a combination of years of experience and education and job role, to help reduce bias in what people are paid. And as a starting point, use this in publicly funded programs. Prioritize compensation for the workforce and public spending, and make compensation a standalone priority, not tied to having to do something else or more than one's job to receive it. And establish a set of equity questions. Imagine the possibilities if we asked, answered, and were held accountable to the responses to these questions. Who does the policy include, and who is left out? What's the plan to continually monitor, assess, and adjust the impact of a policy? And last but not least, are the groups most impacted by a policy included in spaces when policy is being crafted and decisions are being made? Without early educators who are thriving and staying in this work for the long haul, we will never have an ECE system that works for all children and their families. If you accept this premise, then you have to design for it and ensure that the system pays all educators a thriving wage.